It was a quiet morning in the suburbs, one of those peaceful, sun-soaked days that Jack had come to appreciate over the years. He sipped his coffee on the porch, watching the steady rhythm of suburban life unfold. Birds chirped, kids played in the streets, and the distant hum of lawnmowers buzzed in the background. Nothing ever changed around here. It was the perfect place to settle down. But that was about to change. Across the street, Jack noticed the lights flickering on in a house that had been abandoned for months. The house, with its peeling paint and overgrown lawn, had been empty long enough that Jack had grown used to it being a forgotten relic of the neighborhood. But now, things were different. Moving trucks pulled up to the curb, and unfamiliar faces started unloading boxes. Jack squinted from his porch. It wasn't the new neighbors themselves that caught his attention. No, that was just part of suburban life. It was the way they carried themselves. There was something methodical, almost military in their movements. The man, Cole, as Jack later learned, moved with precision, his eyes scanning everything around him like he was assessing a battlefield rather than unpacking boxes. Jack brushed it off. After all, who didn't have a little military discipline in their past? Maybe this guy was just ex-military, adjusting to civilian life like so many others. But then came the first unsettling moment. Cole's eyes met Jack's from across the street. The briefest of glances, but it lingered. Not just a casual look, but one that felt deliberate. Too deliberate. Jack had been watching from his porch, casually observing as any neighbor might. But it wasn't just the glance that caught him off guard. It was the feeling that followed. A strange, gnawing sensation, like being watched from the shadows. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as paranoia. After all, what were the odds that a new neighbor would be anything other than harmless? But that feeling lingered, growing over the next few days as he saw Cole walking around his property. At first, Jack chalked it up to the guy getting familiar with his surroundings. But then the glances started to get more frequent. There were moments when Jack could feel Cole's eyes on him through the windows or across the street, even when there was no logical reason for him to be watching. One evening, Jack caught Cole standing at the edge of his driveway just staring at his house. The streetlight cast long shadows across his face, but there was something about his posture, something tense, as if he were waiting for something. Maybe it was nothing, Jack told himself. Maybe he was just another strange neighbor. But there was an edge to it, something that didn't sit right with him. Jack's hand tightened around his coffee mug as he stared across the street. His thoughts churned. Maybe it was time to go over there, introduce himself, find out what was really going on. But as he looked again, Cole turned and disappeared into the house, vanishing as if he'd never been there at all. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this new neighbor was more than he seemed. Something was off, and Jack had learned over the years to trust his instincts. The neighborhood had always been calm, predictable, and safe. Now it felt like that was about to change. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The feeling of unease Jack had brushed off for days began to settle in, like a dark cloud over his quiet life. It wasn't just the strange glances or the odd movements from across the street anymore. No, it was something deeper, more insidious. Small details began to accumulate, building a sense of dread that Jack couldn't shake. He first noticed it in the mornings. The engine of Cole's car would idle in the driveway for far longer than necessary, sometimes for hours, without the slightest movement. At first, Jack told himself it was nothing. Maybe Cole had been working late. Maybe he was just a man who liked his car to warm up. But the frequency of these odd moments was unsettling, as if Cole was deliberately staying in place, observing the world around him in some silent, methodical way. And then there was the staring. Jack began noticing Cole outside at strange hours, long. After most people had gone to bed, when the neighborhood was blanketed in the silence of the night, he'd stand at the edge of his yard, eyes fixed on the empty street, or worse, directly at Jack's house. It was as if Cole had no need to rush anywhere. His posture was rigid, his gaze unwavering, and it sent an electric shiver down Jack's spine. Why did he stand there for so long? What was he looking for? Jack tried to rationalize it. Maybe Cole was just a solitary man with no real sense of time. But deep down, Jack knew that wasn't the case. There was something off about it. A quiet intensity that lingered in the air. The final straw came one evening, long after the sun had set, and the world outside his windows had turned a dark shade of blue. Jack had installed high-tech security cameras around his property after some petty thefts in the neighborhood. They were his way of ensuring that his family and home were safe. It had become second nature for him to check the feeds, scanning for any signs of trouble. But tonight, when Jack logged into the camera system, he noticed something strange. A glitch. It wasn't much, just a flicker of interference, a brief moment where the footage scrambled. But when the image cleared, Jack froze. On the feed was a shadow moving slowly across his yard. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was unmistakable. Cole. Jack's heart raced, his hand gripping the edge of his chair, as the unease from days past surged into full-blown panic. What was Cole doing on his property in the dead of night? Was he trying to break in? Or was something else going on? Jack leaned closer to the screen, watching the figure linger in the yard, moving with deliberate precision, stopping at random points as if he were scanning the area. The camera angle shifted, and for a moment Jack thought he saw Cole look directly at the camera, his eyes piercing through the lens, almost as if he knew he was being watched. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't just sit back and wait to see what happened next. His instincts were screaming at him to act, to do something before it was too late. But what? What could he do? He wasn't prepared for this. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling, as he dialed the local police. But just as the phone began to ring, Jack hesitated. He couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was bigger than just a strange neighbor. Something more dangerous was at play, and he needed to figure out what it was before it consumed him. His eyes never left the screen, watching Cole move like a shadow across his yard. It was a warm evening, the kind where the air felt thick and slow, hanging heavy with the scent of fresh soil and the distant hum of crickets. Jack had been out in the garden tending to his vegetables, something he found peaceful after a long day. His hands worked automatically, moving through the familiar motions of pulling weeds and checking on the plants. But the sense of peace he'd once found here was slipping away, replaced by an odd feeling gnawing at him from the inside. Something about the day just didn't sit right. He wasn't sure if it was the way the air felt heavier than usual, or the way his eyes kept drifting to Cole's house across the street, where the curtains were drawn, but the lights were on, flickering in the windows like some sort of signal. And then, just as Jack glanced up from his work, he saw Cole. The man was across the street, moving with purpose toward Jack's property. His posture was military, rigid, confident. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew it was time to finally address the strange tension that had been building over the past few days. This wasn't just a casual neighborly interaction. There was something more at play, and Jack couldn't ignore it any longer. With a sigh, Jack wiped his hands on his pants and stood up, stretching his back as he made his way across the street to meet the man. His footsteps felt heavy, the weight of what he was about to do hanging over him. He needed answers, needed to get to the bottom of this before it spiraled into something worse. "Hey, Cole!" Jack called out, his voice slightly louder than necessary, trying to sound casual. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he realized how forced they sounded. The tension in his chest was palpable, a pressure he couldn't shake. His voice was too tight, and he hated how obvious it was. Cole turned slowly, his movements precise, like he was processing the situation with military-like efficiency. There was no surprise in his eyes, no sign that he hadn't been expecting Jack. He just nodded, his face unreadable. His posture didn't shift an inch. "All good," Cole replied, his voice clipped, almost cold. "Just getting settled in." The words were simple enough, but Jack didn't buy it. There was a weight in Cole's tone, a stiffness that didn't match the casual nature of his words. Jack couldn't pinpoint what it was, but he could feel it, the tension radiating off the man like static in the air. Jack studied him carefully. The kind of man who walked around like Cole didn't do so by accident. His movements were controlled, deliberate. Every shift of his body, every tilt of his head, screamed military discipline. It made Jack uneasy, like he was talking to a stranger, who wasn't really a stranger at all. He wasn't sure why, but in that moment Jack felt like he was staring at something much bigger than a simple neighborly interaction. "Glad to hear it," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady, but his mind was already racing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a small part of him felt like he'd just made a mistake. Cole's expression remained neutral, but Jack noticed the way his eyes flicked to the house, to the window where Jack's security camera was mounted. His gaze lingered just a moment too long. Jack caught the look, and for the first time, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The conversation ended quickly, as if Cole had already lost interest. "Catch you later," Cole muttered, turning on his heel and walking back to his house with the same purposeful stride. Jack stood there for a moment watching him go, his heart still thudding in his chest. There was something more to Cole than just a military man with a quiet demeanor. Jack could feel it in the air, like an electric current he couldn't escape. This was only the beginning. The uneasy feeling that Jack had been trying to ignore for days finally got the better of him. The sensation of something lurking just out of sight, something that didn't quite belong, gnawed at him with an intensity he couldn't shake. He couldn't ignore the strange events piling up, and the latest discovery only made the tension worse. His security system, the one he had installed as a precaution, had caught something chilling. Late one night, as Jack reviewed the footage, a series of encrypted messages flickered across the camera feed. The data stream was scrambled, but Jack's software had been able to catch it, a trail that led straight to Cole's house. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just static or a glitch. This was deliberate. Whoever was behind those messages wasn't just sending them into the ether. They were connected to Cole. Jack leaned back in his chair, eyes wide, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The realization hit him hard. Cole wasn't just some retired soldier who had moved into the neighborhood to escape his past. No, Cole was involved in something much darker, something far more sinister than Jack had anticipated. But what? And why him? Why was Cole, of all people, involved with whatever this was? Unable to let it go, Jack knew he had to act. He couldn't just sit back and hope it would all resolve itself. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. Over the next few days, he began watching Cole more closely. Every movement, every action, became a potential clue. The suspicion that had been growing in Jack's gut now took root in his mind, and he couldn't stop the feeling that the answers were all within reach. He just had to connect the dots. Day wasn't long before Jack's careful observations paid off. He had been monitoring the area around Cole's house when he saw it, a shadow darting across the yard late at night, just as Jack had feared. It was Cole, stepping out of his house, with a purposeful stride, dressed in dark clothes that made him blend into the night. He glanced both ways before moving toward the back of his property, disappearing into the trees beyond. Jack's pulse quickened. He couldn't let this opportunity slip by. Grabbing his coat, he quietly slipped out the back door, keeping low, as he made his way to a vantage point in his own backyard. His surveillance cameras had shown him a pattern. Cole wasn't just out for a midnight walk. He was meeting someone. And he wasn't alone. From his position, Jack could see two figures emerge from the shadows, both cloaked in darkness, just as covert as Cole. They exchanged hurried whispers, their movements sharp and deliberate. Jack's breath hitched as he watched them pass something between each other, papers, or something else. He couldn't be sure, but whatever it was too important to be handled casually. His instincts screamed that this wasn't a friendly exchange. Cole stood like a sentinel, keeping watch over the meeting, his military background evident in the way he carried himself. There was no doubt in Jack's mind now. Cole wasn't just blending in. He was orchestrating something much larger than he had anticipated. The pieces were falling into place, and Jack was certain of one thing: whatever was going on, he was caught in the middle. He had to know more, had to uncover what Cole was hiding before it was too late. The weight of the revelation hit Jack like a sledgehammer. His suspicions, which had been festering for weeks, had finally found their confirmation. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand, disbelief still clinging to him. The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in years. Marco, an old military contact from his past. They had parted ways after Jack retired, but the bond they shared was one forged in the heat of battle. Now, Marco's words were burning through the haze of Jack's thoughts. "Cole's not who you think he is," Marco's voice crackled over the line, low and urgent. "He's working with a covert group, one that's been tracking high-profile individuals. Your neighborhood, your house, it's not random. They've been watching you for a while, Jack. You're in their sights now." Jack's heart slammed against his chest. He stood up, pacing the room. His mind raced, trying to process what Marco was telling him. This wasn't just some strange coincidence. Cole's arrival in the neighborhood, his odd behavior, the encrypted messages. It all led back to this hidden organization, a shadowy group with a reach that extended far beyond Jack's understanding. "They've been tracking people like you. Jack," Marco continued, his voice grim, "you're a high-value target, and that house of yours? It's no accident. They've been watching you for a long time, gathering intel, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Cole? He's not a neighbor. He's a pawn, a link in a much bigger chain." Jack's head spun. He had thought his life was calm, predictable, safe, even. He had no idea he had been walking through a fog, unaware of the dark eyes watching him, waiting for the right time to strike. The neighborhood that he'd once considered peaceful now felt like a minefield, each step a potential trigger. "I've seen these guys before," Marco's voice pulled Jack back to the present. "They're well-funded, well-connected. These aren't just rogue agents. This is an organization with power. They manipulate people, control outcomes, and eliminate anyone who stands in their way." Jack gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "So what do I do?" His voice was a whisper, barely more than a rasp. "How do I fight back against something like this?" Marco paused, the silence on the other end heavy. "You can't do it alone, but you can't let them win either. They'll use whatever they've got to bring you down. They'll try to break you, isolate you, but you've got to fight back. Trust no one, not even Cole. He's just the tip of the iceberg." The gravity of Marco's warning settled over Jack like a heavy blanket. He had no choice but to act, and fast. But how? How could he fight a well-organized covert group with eyes everywhere? How could he trust anyone when the very people around him might be part of the web? The realization hit him with a cold clarity. He was no longer just a man protecting his home. He was now caught in a dangerous game, one with rules he didn't understand, and opponents who had been playing for far longer than he had even known. Jack exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced out the window, watching the evening sunset over the quiet street. But it wasn't quiet anymore. Not in his mind. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle was only just beginning. Jack's mind raced as he paced through his home, the plan playing out in his mind like a high-stakes game of chess. He had reached out to a handful of trusted contacts, former military buddies, law enforcement officials who owed him favors, and the wheels of his trap were already in motion. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to take control, to turn the tables on Cole and his mysterious group. His first move was simple, but it carried enormous risk. Make his home seem vulnerable. Jack had always prided himself on being a man of preparation, but he had to let down his guard. Just a little. He disabled the outer layers of his security system, the cameras that watched every corner of his property, and even the motion sensors that were set to trigger alarms at the slightest disturbance. He didn't want anyone to feel like they were being watched, not until the trap was fully set. The plan was dangerous. If anyone caught on, Jack would be left with nothing but his own nerves. But if it worked, if he could draw them in, it would all be worth it. He just had to remain patient. For the next several days, Jack became a ghost in his own home, lurking in the shadows. He spent sleepless nights staring through his window, his eyes fixed on the empty street, waiting for any sign that the enemy was close. His gut told him they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jack wasn't going to wait any longer. The anxiety gnawed at him, building with every hour. What if they didn't take the bait? What if the danger he feared was just a figment of his imagination? He couldn't afford that doubt to creep in. He had made his decision. Now he had to see it through. Then one night it finally happened. The wind rustled through the trees, and Jack's sharp eyes caught the first movement, a shadow slipping between his front gate and the hedges. His heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't flinch. This was what he'd been waiting for. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving with purpose, their silhouette barely visible against the night. Jack's breath hitched as the figure crept closer to the house. He stood stock still, watching, waiting for confirmation. And then a second figure appeared behind the first, followed by a third. The trap had been sprung. Jack's pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. His fingers flew across his phone, activating the backup plan he had hidden from even his closest allies. The secondary surveillance system, one he had rigged specifically for this moment, came online, sending a live feed straight to his phone. But it wasn't just cameras. The authorities, who had been waiting for this moment, were already in position, ready to move in. The figures continued to advance, unaware that they were walking into a well-laid snare. Jack watched as they crossed the threshold of his property, creeping closer to the house. Each step felt like it echoed through his body, the tension unbearable. This was it, the moment when everything would change. His phone buzzed in his hand. A text from one of his military contacts. "We're in position. Wait for the signal." Jack nodded to himself, even though no one was around to see it. He wasn't alone in this. He had planned every detail down to the last second, every move accounted for. The men approaching his house weren't just intruders. They were pieces in a much larger game, and Jack was about to flip the board. The figures were almost at the front door now, and Jack's breath was steady. He held up his phone and tapped out one last message. Now. The trap was set. The game had begun. And with a faint flicker of lights, the first wave of law enforcement swarmed into position, closing off any escape routes for the men on his property. Jack felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing that his life, and the lives of those he loved, were about to change forever. The quiet of the night shattered as the rogue group made their move. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady as he observed the figures moving through the darkness, making their way toward his house. He had prepared for this. He had known it would come to this. The moment they crossed his property line, Jack hit the button under his desk. The alarms blared through the house, hidden sirens blaring to life, sending a sharp wave of sound through the air. Doors locked, shutters slammed down over windows, and steel gates dropped into place, enclosing his property like a fortress. The trap had sprung. For a few moments there was chaos. The dark figures, armed and ready, surged forward, trying to breach the barriers that Jack had put in place. The shadows outside were frantic, slamming into the gates and windows, but it was too late. They were already trapped. Jack remained calm, watching from the security room. His mind was sharp, calculating. He knew the authorities were on their way. He had a team in place, ready to move in and mop up the mess. But for now, it was just him and the intruders. They were in his house, his space, and they were going to learn just how wrong they had been to come here. He could see the frustration building in the group, their movements growing more erratic as they struggled against the traps Jack had set up. Their time was running out. The law enforcement team would be here soon. But then, through the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was Cole. For a moment, Jack froze. He'd been expecting this, but seeing Cole standing there, so calm, so composed, made the moment feel surreal. Jack's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm, to stay in control. This was the confrontation he had been waiting for. "I know what you're doing, Cole," Jack said, his voice low and steady. He didn't shout. There was no need. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "It's over." Cole didn't flinch. His eyes, dark and unblinking, locked onto Jack's. He looked like he hadn't been caught in a trap at all. Like everything was still, under his control. "You have no idea what you're really involved in," Cole said, his voice almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Jack's blood ran cold. There was a deep sense of foreboding in Cole's words, but Jack wasn't about to let it rattle him. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Cole's. This was it, the culmination of everything. The man who had been watching him, spying on him, and pulling strings from the shadows was finally standing before him. Before Jack could respond, a flash of movement from the perimeter caught his eye. The authorities were closing in. Jack had done it. He had trapped them. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel signaled the arrival of law enforcement, and Cole's expression shifted, just a fraction. The moment of truth had arrived as the officers swarmed in. The intruders were quickly overpowered, their weapons confiscated, and their attempts to escape futile. The dark figures, just pawns in a game Jack had only begun to understand, were subdued and handcuffed within moments. But Cole remained calm. He didn't struggle, didn't resist. His eyes met Jack's one last time, and in that glance, Jack saw something more than just the man who had been watching him from across the street. "What is this, Cole?" Jack asked, his voice tight with frustration. "What's really going on here?" Cole didn't answer. Instead, he smirked, a knowing look in his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough," he said cryptically, before being led away by the officers. As the authorities secured the scene, Jack stood there, the weight of Cole's words hanging in the air. His mind raced. Was there something bigger going on? Was Cole part of a larger operation, something far more dangerous than Jack had ever imagined? The pieces didn't fit yet, but one thing was clear. Cole's involvement was just the tip of the iceberg. Jack looked out over his property, the chaos slowly settling down. For now, he had won. But Cole's words lingered, and Jack knew that this was far from over. There was more to this story, more to uncover, more to fight against, and no matter what, Jack was ready. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur. Jack's nerves were on edge, his mind still reeling from the chaos. The rogue group had been dismantled. Cole was behind bars, and for a fleeting moment, Jack thought that everything would return to normal. But nothing would ever be the same again. His property, the quiet suburban life he had worked so hard to protect, had been a pawn in a much larger, far more dangerous game. He had won the battle, but the war was still unfolding. The world around him, once so predictable, now seemed like a fragile illusion, one that could collapse at any moment. as Jack sat at his kitchen table one afternoon, sipping a coffee that had gone cold. He let his mind wander back to the cryptic words Cole had left him with. "You have no idea what you're really involved in." It was a riddle Jack couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to move on. That was when it happened. His phone buzzed on the table, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. Jack glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the unknown number. The message that followed made his stomach drop like a stone into a deep abyss. "This is Agent Reynolds. You don't know me, but I know you. What you just experienced is only the surface of something much larger. The organization Cole worked for is one arm of a much more expansive network. They've been watching you for a long time. They'll come for you again." Jack's hand shook slightly as he read and reread the message. His mind raced. A government agent. A conspiracy so vast that it stretched beyond anything he had ever imagined. He'd been so focused on Cole, on the small group that had invaded his life, that he hadn't considered the possibility that there were bigger players at work, players who had been pulling strings in the shadows for years. The weight of the message settled over him like a thick fog. Jack had thought he'd won. He'd thought the danger was behind him. But the truth was much more unsettling. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. "God," Jack muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. The walls around him felt like they were closing in. He had narrowly escaped this first confrontation, but what came next? Was he a target now? A pawn in a game that he didn't understand? The unease that had been growing in him ever since Cole first moved into the neighborhood now bloomed into full-blown fear. There was a knock at the door. Jack jumped at the sound, instinctively reaching for his phone to check the time. 3:15 p.m. He wasn't expecting anyone. With a deep breath, Jack rose and moved toward the door. His mind raced with questions. Could this be it? Was it finally happening? He opened the door to find nothing. No one there. Except for a small envelope on the ground, addressed to him in sharp black letters. With trembling fingers, Jack picked it up. Inside there was just a single sheet of paper, its contents scrawled hastily in a dark ink that seemed to stain the page. "They're watching. Don't trust anyone. You're already too deep." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't over. And whoever was behind this, whoever had orchestrated everything, was still very much out there. Watching, waiting. Jack steeled himself. He wasn't going down without a fight. Whatever came next, he would be ready. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.